Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sonia Alam, Chief Operating Officer at CFA Society France. Welcome to this webinar. Following the strong interest generated by our last event with Signum Global Advisors, in February, we are delighted to continue this discussion today with a new session focused on the evolving geopolitical landscape. I know you will like it. We are pleased to be joined by George Pollack, Senior Analyst for US and Canada Policy, and Nico Fitzroy, Partner and Senior Europe Analyst from Signum Global Advisors. If you have any questions during the webinar, don't hesitate to write them down in the Q&A section below. This session is recorded. Thank you all for joining us today, and I will hand over to our speakers.
Great. Thank you, Sonia, for the introduction. Yeah, like you said, Signum Global is a geopolitical analysis firm. I lead our Europe research. I think we'll start with Europe and then go to George to cover the US. But maybe big picture perspective. I think the kind of geopolitical landscape, and this refers particularly to Europe, but the geopolitical landscape has shifted a lot since I think President Trump won the US election. I think the world has shifted from. And this was already happening, but it's kind of accelerated in the sense that he shifted the world away from interest in multilateral institutions. He works bilaterally, but also he works specifically in a way that kind of targets vulnerability and uses leverage. So this is a world now where if you are particularly vulnerable in certain areas, you will be targeted. And I think Europe is uniquely vulnerable in a number of areas right now. I think Europe is an energy importer. And that means that, the Iran war is an example of a conflict that kicked off where the actual energy coming out of the Strait of Hormuz that was closed, not much of that was heading to Europe, but Europe was uniquely not uniquely, but was very vulnerable to that conflict nonetheless, because it is an importer, because it depends on LNG imports in particular, which move according to kind of geopolitical events. It's vulnerable also because it depends for a lot of its tech imports on the US, and increasingly that looks like an area of fragility, particularly from some of the messaging coming out of the White House recently on kind of access to advanced AI models. Europe is also vulnerable when it comes to raw materials. It depends very heavily on China for its access to rare earths, and not just rare earths, other raw materials as well. So that's kind of its industrial base is quite vulnerable, and that applies particularly to the auto sector and the defense sector. And so I think what that means is that Europe is in a position where big geopolitical things that happen, big events, big wars that break out, the Strait of Hormuz being closed is a great example, but it could be any number of things, are always going to impact Europe in a world where supply chains are disrupted, where leverage gets used, where vulnerability is kind of played on. And so I think because of that, Europe is in a position where things are probably about to change quite a lot, both things that are hitting it, but also the policy objectives that governments have now. A lot of that revolves around trying to reduce dependencies externally. The main issue, though, is that is incredibly expensive. So, I mean, just to talk about some of the kind of big geopolitical events that have happened that affect Europe, in terms of the Iran conflict, that has come to some sort of conclusion. It's debatable about how long that conclusion will last, but certainly in the short term, it does seem likely that there will be a big uptick in oil and fuel exports out of the Strait of Hormuz. So that's in general relatively positive for Europe, I think. But I think there are three main areas or mechanisms, I guess, where that conflict is still going to impact Europe, regardless of the fact it has ended. One of them, and this is a good example of where the kind of vulnerability lies for Europe. One of them is in macroeconomic indicators. In 2022, there was a big hit to the European economy because of the shutoff of Russian gas, not all of it, but most gas being piped into Europe. And what that mainly drove was a big uptick in inflation to well over 10% in most European countries. This time round, that impact is much lower. For a number of reasons, but mainly because the European economy was coming into it in a weaker position. So demand wasn't there to eat much higher costs. And that means that businesses are the ones that were most affected by supply chain disruption this time. They were unable to pass on the costs in the same way. The second thing is that European countries now have much higher, certainly have higher debt loads and also much higher interest rates. So debt servicing costs are much higher than they were back then for many countries in Europe. There just isn't the fiscal space for Europe to roll out massive stimulus. And so I think what that means is that the kind of impact of the Iran conflict, even though it has ended, there will still be impacts in terms of price. Fertilizer prices rose a lot. That will impact food prices heading into next year. Fuel prices rose a lot. That will impact businesses over the next few months, producers of things like plastics, etc., which fuel is an important input for. All of that is going to impact the economy. But this time, unlike 2022, I think it's businesses where the main impact will fall because there isn't the government support. So in terms of the macroeconomy, that's a key area of impact. The second thing is on fiscal policy in Europe. I think that European governments are quite weak at the moment in general, as a broad statement. Um, a lot of those governments have tight fiscal positions and are in kind of major long-running disputes about how to fix that. I think France is a good example of that. The UK is definitely a good example of that. Increasingly, Germany will become an example of that as well. And even small changes to the overall outlook, in terms of small changes to the growth outlook, to the inflation outlook, small changes to the interest rate outlook, in all these countries, that will lead to a tightening fiscal outlook, which means making difficult decisions for governments, having to find 10 billion euros to fill a gap in the case of the UK, more than that for France, even more than that for Germany over the next 2, 3 years. And I think the big impact of that, even though the conflict with Iran conflict has ended, that is going to lead to a worse outlook economically. That is therefore going to lead to a tighter situation fiscally. And I think that there are governments who are going to really suffer from that. And I think the one I would be watching is probably Germany. Germany, there's a government there that is struggling at the moment. It will probably survive the year, but over the next 2, 3 years, it's going to have to fill huge fiscal gaps in its budget. And I think it's very unlikely it will be able to do that. So that's, the stability of governments is another area where geopolitical ruptures will have an impact in Europe. And then I think the third area, which maybe George will talk a bit about as well, is in terms of US relations. I think the war in Iran has been very unpopular in Europe. It's made President Trump even more unpopular in Europe. But I think the big thing that has shifted is previously when Europeans were dealing with the US over the last year, it was leaders trying to placate Trump. They were trying to basically go along with what he was saying in the hope things would calm down. The difference now is voters in Europe are putting a lot more pressure on governments not to behave like that in the same way. And heading into 2027, there are a lot of elections in Europe. There are elections in France, of course, but also in Spain, Italy, Poland. There may be a new government in the UK. We think there will be actually. So a new prime minister, sorry. So I think, there are a lot of fragile governments facing elections that are now under pressure from their electorates to push back against Trump. And I think the Iran war has been the big trigger of that, the big trigger of the shift there, which is kind of like bottom up pressure rather than top down pressure on what politicians do. And the electoral cycle is clearly going to play into that. So I think in the short term, there are massive incentives to kind of for stability actually between the EU and the US, I guess, around the trade deal in particular. It makes sense for the EU now. They have more or less finalized the trade deal with the US. That will happen in the next few weeks to ensure that situation remains stable over the next few months. And as George has pointed out to me a few times, Trump needs some of his Republican senators and governors to be able to sell something when it comes to trade heading into the midterms. And so that's a kind of argument for stability short term. But post midterms, heading into this European electoral cycle, it's likely there will be more confrontation, I think, between the EU and the US on trade. Probably that comes with more threats on tariffs. And I think a big factor is the Iran conflict and the impact that's had on public attitudes towards the US and towards President Trump. I should say now, if people have questions, please put them in the Q&A as we go along, and we can answer them. But yeah, for now, I will just head into the kind of the next. So I mentioned there the electoral cycle in Europe. I think that electoral cycle is really important. Obviously, happy to delve into any of those elections. But I think a big factor within that is because of all those elections in Europe, there is a big impetus to reform things before that cycle begins. And we're seeing movements as a direct result of that. There is a move now to accelerate some of the reforms that might lead to the capital markets union in Europe, for example. That's something that there is an incentive to push towards, to secure the long-term budget for Europe, which will include more strategic spending than before on things like defense, tech, things that will reduce dependencies. At the same time, if those things don't happen by the time this electoral cycle starts, it's very likely they will be delayed for quite a long time because France obviously it will be in April, but there could be multiple elections, important elections over the next over the first 6 to 9 months of next year that will provide problems, I think, in terms of trying to secure reforms. Inevitably, I think in general that means a lot of the reform agenda that the EU is pushing will ultimately be delayed. I think stuff like the Capital Markets Union is already a difficult issue, but this electoral cycle means that there will essentially be a pause, I think, for 6 to 12 months during that cycle on the really difficult stuff like this. So I think that as well as affecting US relations, I think internally next year is going to be a really difficult year in Europe to kind of get things done. But beyond that, on the question of what Europe can get done, there is a question actually in the chat. Maybe I'll just go to that. Um, hang on, I'll just answer the question. Maybe we're about to see more ratings downgrades and adjustments for G7 countries in this environment. So I think had the Iran conflict continued, I think that would have been a really viable possibility. As it stands, actually, there is a real reluctance. So, firstly, now that with a seeming solution or resolution to that conflict, there is a little bit of upside for some European economies. The fiscal pressure that they would have faced is a little bit smaller. I think that the issue is not so much ratings downgrades in the near term. The issue is more political stability and whether governments can deal with the kind of some of the small scale fiscal pressures that they will be under as a result of this. I think political stability is the main takeaway rather than ratings downgrades. But medium term political stability is one of the factors that feeds into ratings downgrades. So I see that as a kind of medium term risk. And I think France is definitely an example of that, where the pressure that would have happened had the Iran war continued on the public accounts would have been greater. So the fact it has ended is a positive. But medium term, over the next 2-3 years, if there's no ability to rein in the budget, then ratings downgrades will be the obvious kind of conclusion to that. So I think that is something over the next medium to long term, but maybe not short term, that I would be looking at. In terms of so on the European kind of strategic autonomy agenda, I mentioned at the beginning that dependencies are the main issue Europe's facing right now. I think there are a few areas to look at, but there are probably 4 areas that Europe is really looking at right now. One is China, the dependency on China's rare earth access to China's rare earths, and particularly the processing dominance that China has there, is a big problem for Europe, because right now maybe the biggest problem facing the European economy is the undercutting of its industrial base by cheaper and in many cases better Chinese imports. This is already costing the German economy around 10,000 jobs per month, which is a huge amount and has been doing that for a number of years now. Studies in Germany suggesting that 400,000 jobs have been lost in the last 5 years purely as a result of direct competition from China. So the European economy is facing a big shock because of competition from China. But there's very little that Europe can do about it because of those rare earth dependencies. I think over the next year or so, 6 to 12 months, say, there will be an increase in trade tensions there. There will be some additional tariffs from both sides. But actually, in a way, the dominance that China has over rare earths probably prevents a major trade war because Europe is basically Europe doesn't have escalation dominance, as the phrase in the industry always puts it. But and that's a major factor that is going to affect the macroeconomy because it means problems for the industrial base in Germany and beyond in Europe. The second factor, I think, is on the kind of specific reforms and changes that the Commission is undergoing. I think one of the big shifts that these geopolitical pressures that are putting on Europe has led to is that the European Commission is much more pragmatic now on securing trade deals. In the last year, it secured trade deals with Indonesia, India, Australia, and Mercosur. And I think there will be more in the next couple of years, probably with Thailand, Malaysia are 2 others that it's targeting. These deals are probably not as good for Europe as they would have been negotiated 2 or 3 years ago. But the point is they are now negotiating very quickly to try and secure these deals. So one of the big shifts here is that Europe is opening up a lot of new trade deals to try and deal with this. second, there's a question here. Do you have a specific perspective on the next French election? Sure. Okay, I will dive into that. um, so I think on the next French election, I'm assuming that Le Pen will not be able to run. Obviously, we'll find out in I think it's July 7th whether that is the case or not. But assuming she isn't, I think Bardella actually has a slightly better chance of winning than she would have done. I think the issue for the RN has always been the second round of the presidential election. You need 50+%, and there's a ceiling that they failed to kind of break through in the mid 40s, I guess. I think Bardella has a better chance of doing that than Le Pen because aside from loyal party voters and voters on the right, he is someone that appeals to maybe a slightly different demographic. His social media presence, he's a bit younger. So, if you need a few extra percentage points to get over the line, Bardella probably has a better chance than Le Pen. Having said that, I think at this point, he's obviously the heavy favorite if you look at the betting markets. I believe if he is in a second round runoff against anyone from the left, I think he will probably win. Mélenchon, I think, all the polling suggests he would win quite easily against Mélenchon. But I also think, a more kind of centre-left candidate he would probably beat as well, Glucksmann, for example. So basically, whether or not he wins, I think will come down to whether our centrist, I mean, Philippe is the obvious example right now in terms of polling, can get to the second round. And I actually think that is still the most likely outcome, that we'll see Philippe, or maybe another centrist, but we'll say Philippe right now is the most likely versus Bardella in the second round, because I think the left-wing vote in the first round will be more split than the centrist vote. In the end, I think candidates like Attal and Philippe will ultimately, whoever is in the lead out of those two, for example, whoever's behind out of those two, I think will end up dropping out. And so the centrist vote will coalesce around a single candidate. On the left, I don't think that will happen. I think at least two candidates will be in the running. I think Mélenchon obviously is going to run, and then a candidate of the centre left, but it could easily be three candidates. And so I think the left wing vote will be more split than the centrist vote, and that ultimately will allow someone like Philippe to get to the second round. And at that point, he has a pretty good chance still of beating Bardella. So I don't know, when I speak to people in France, a lot of them talk about a Bardella-Mélenchon runoff, or the fact Bardella is clearly the most likely to win. I think at this point, I'm still scared. I think that maybe is a little bit overhyped. I actually still think Philippe is probably the most likely to win based on that kind of calculation. But clearly Bardella has a pretty strong chance. And as I said, I think a better chance than Le Pen would have done. In terms of so on Europe's kind of reform agenda, one of the other big things that's happening, well, two things. So one is, I mentioned trade, the other is on deregulation. So the European Commission is deregulating, I guess. I mean, they call it simplification, but they're basically trying to reduce red tape. The two ways they're doing this are delaying the introduction of things they previously agreed and reducing the number of companies that regulations apply to. And so this is actually happening for the first time ever. There's a majority in the European Parliament and the European Commission to do this if needed. And so this is going to progress over the next few years. It will continue to go. And once it starts, basically what this has done is it has opened up the Commission to very, very heavy lobbying, because in order to do this quickly, they've decided to do it with politicians instead of experts. But the politicians don't necessarily have the capabilities to comb through 1,000-page documents in great detail and figure out exactly what needs to stay and doesn't stay. And so they're leaning heavily on businesses. And so right now, deregulation is very likely to continue because they have majorities in Parliament and the Council to push for it, but also because businesses are the ones that politicians are relying on to tell them what does or doesn't need to be in there. And that is always a massive accelerator of reducing red tape, because businesses are obviously pushing for that. So that's something that is changing as well. And I think the other big thing that is changing is in the tech landscape, where digital sovereignty is suddenly the number one issue for a lot of European policymakers. As mentioned, the US restricting access to kind of the top end Anthropic AI models is an example of why European leaders are suddenly very worried about their dependencies. Around 80% of Europe's digital infrastructure is bought in or paid for from abroad. A lot of that obviously is from the US and US companies. And so I think we will see a lot of money invested in this over the next couple of years. Things like the digital euro is one of the things that I think will come as a result of this. There will be enough support to kind of get that over the line. The big issue, though, that Europe faces is in funding. It doesn't have the money. It doesn't have a combined pot of money to compete with the US or with China in terms of supporting businesses. And so ultimately, all of this is going to take a really long time, and 5, 10 years for Europe. And in that time, it does face huge problems in terms of competition from both China and the US. So I think there are big changes happening on trade, on regulation, but the big picture changes that really need to happen: tech sovereignty, capital markets union, some of the defense issues such as nuclear, the nuclear umbrella. I guess France could be a major player in that. These are all things that will take many years and cost a lot of money. So I think Europe is kind of playing in a race against time on that front. A question on what will be the US-EU relationship concerning the military NATO subject. Yeah, so maybe the one other thing I haven't touched on, which is worth touching on for Europe, is Ukraine, which relates to this. But on NATO, I guess, I mean, George, I'll hand over to you in a minute. You can give the US perspective maybe. But um, I guess our view is that the US legally, well, I guess NATO is two things. One is it is a legal construct. You have members that have agreed to be there. They pay money in. They have operational interdependencies. The other is it's a kind of an article of faith. The Article 5 part of NATO, the deterrence element, depends on other countries believing that if triggered, NATO countries would come to each other's aid, and NATO countries need to believe that as well for it to still function. In terms of the legal construct of NATO, I think leaving NATO is legally very difficult for Trump. So we don't think that the legal idea of NATO is about to end due to the US leaving it. But in terms of the kind of article of faith around deterrence, I've done a lot of meetings with businesses across Europe, and I have not met many or any recently that believe that the US would come to the aid of Estonia, say, if Russia invaded in the next few weeks. Now, whether that's right or wrong, that is currently the view of presumably Russia and also most NATO countries in Europe. And so what that means, I think, is right now, NATO is kind of comatose, I guess. And that is pushing a lot of European countries to think about a European version of NATO, meaning arms procurement directed only at European countries, and operational decisions made by European countries with each other. That's still a long way from happening. And there are multiple countries in Europe that still see the US as the most important security guarantor, much more than Germany, than the UK, than France, than the EU. These would be countries, particularly on the border of Russia. And that's unlikely to change anytime soon. I think that, Europe has a long way before it can come close to replacing NATO. That probably will never happen, actually, but it has a long way to do that. And so for now, I think there's a kind of sort of slightly comatose status quo that NATO is under, which is that people are unsure whether it still exists, but no one is yet willing to test that thesis, and therefore it kind of continues to drag on. What is also true is when I speak to people, people at the level below politicians in NATO, is that they say operationally NATO is functioning fine. The issue right now is political decision making, and so it depends a lot on the leadership in the US, I think, essentially. And maybe that is a good moment actually to hand over to you, George. Yeah.
Sounds great. I think to build off what Nico just laid out, we'll start with the state of the US-EU relationship from the US perspective. This is going to sound not counter, but kind of contradictory to what Nico just talked about, but it's true. It's where we are today with President Trump, I think is likely going to be the high point of the US-EU relationship in terms of future Republican administrations. Well, I know that is disconcerting to hear, especially because, as Nico has laid out, there's concerns about NATO, there's concerns about trade relationships, there's concerns about US involvement in EU politics relating to our politicians flying over to places like Hungary and becoming more involved in campaigning for more far-right figures and more inflammatory figures. It's difficult to imagine how this is the high point. But for me, where I come from, as when I speak with folks in the US, the president and his administration is largely transactional. As long as you are willing to work with the administration and make conducive agreements with the administration, and I suppose entertain the president's ideas, you can have a potentially positive relationship. Yes, if you criticize him, if you go against him, there will be pushback, and that pushback will be severe. But there is an avenue for which politicians today, and that includes the likes of Starmer in the UK, Macron in France, Merz in Germany, Meloni in Italy, whoever else you want to think about, who are within the range of normalcy to have that positive relationship. I think as we are now dealing with a Republican Party that has a unit or a semblance of supporters that are in ascendance are more isolationist, more aggressive on cultural issues, and much less willing to even entertain the idea of a US-UEU relationship as we've come to know about it since the end of World War II. And I think as Vance and his ilk rise up and begin take power in this Republican Party, I do believe we're going to see the Republican Party shift to a place that's going to be more adversarial to the EU, less transactional, and more ideologically extreme and more ideologically bent in their approach to the EU. And I think you've kind of seen the start of this to an extent at the State Department, where they have the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, Sarah Rogers. Sarah Rogers has basically focused on ensuring that every far-right politician is supported by the US and is given the ability to travel to the US, meet with leading officials in the State Department, and have a possibility to interact with such officials. She, while thankfully is not setting policy, and for my conversations, she's setting the future of where the Republican Party wants to be. And that does mean, even if it is not helpful, as we saw in Hungary, where Vance and Rubio's campaigning, in fact, did not help Orban hold out for his victory, it will become to a place where they're going to lean more heavily on getting a European that is not just, as they've said repeatedly, and they're clear about, that is not just focused on shared values, but is truly focused on a shared culture. And their culture is one that will not work with the Europe as it is today. And I think at least with this president, you have that transactional relationship with the future President Vance, a future President Josh Hawley, a future President Eric Schmidt from Missouri. You will see a much more aggressive approach and a much more pugnacious approach to the future of the US EU relationship. And I suppose even more willing to get involved in internal EU affairs and even more willing to subject the EU to pressure when the bloc or the entities or countries make a decision that is counter to the US's preferred policies. And so for me, as counterintuitive as it sounds, with all the difficulties today, I think we are again, it is maybe interspersed with a Democratic administration that will return to some kind of status quo US EU normalcy, but we are coming into a Republican Party that will be predisposed to be much more aggressive towards the EU, and I think that's going to be a continuing trend. I guess going from there, if there's any questions, as always, feel free to ask in the Q&A. I will turn it to the midterms because I imagine that's of top of mind concern. So where we are, well, firstly, I think where I want to start this conversation is there's always this notion that the midterms do not change a lot, that the president will continue to be powerful and that the president will continue to do what he wants. His approach to the EU will not be checked. His approach to trade will not be checked. His approach to foreign policy will not be checked. And that is true to an extent, but there are certain things that are going to become issues regardless of what happens. Firstly, in terms of the US, we are going to continue to have issues with funding the government. I would expect us to have more government shutdowns, which I imagine for folks in the EU markets means you're not going to have as reliable US data. It means that we're going to be more unpredictable as to our funding mechanisms. It means that our defense obligations and things of that nature might become more uncertain, and it means that we're going to generally operate at a place where the federal government will not be fully functional. My for me, the reason I feel this way is our sense that as of today, Democrats are likely to take the House, while Republicans are just going to hold on to the Senate. I apologize. There's a question. Okay, in terms of more willing to be aggressive and begin conflicts like Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, Israel, China. Yes, I'm glad you asked that question, and I apologize for hopping around. I'm happy to touch on that now. We do expect the president to be much more aggressive on foreign policy. The way we have framed it, he will be more focused on legacy building, and that legacy building is going to largely come from his foreign policy ambitions. So and the issue is here, he can operate with much of a check from the president, from the Congress. In terms of Cuba, it is our expectation that we are going to attempt to get regime change in Cuba after, in the wake of the midterms, that is coming, and that the president is not going to give this up, and that while the Iran war, the consequences of that have delayed it, we are coming to a place where the administration is building up its case to take on Cuba, and as part of its goal of realigning the Western Hemisphere with the U.S. and sort of rebuilding a fortress North America in the area surrounding the United States. Part of that is going to be in Cuba. And that will mean likely attempting to, right now what they're doing is attempting to exert pressure, but our expectation is that pressure will fail because of the way the Cuban government system is set up to avoid the similar, I suppose, key man issue that Venezuela had, where thanks to work, at least our Latin American analyst supposes, working with folks like Delcy, they were able to coordinate the removal of Maduro and replace him with Delcy with very little dysfunction. Here in Cuba, that is not the same thing. And if the Cuban regime is not willing to moderate its approach to the US and not willing to moderate its approach to business, we do feel that after the midterms, both for the president's foreign policy legacy and because of Secretary of State Marco Rubio's historic approach to Cuba, they are going to become more aggressive and seek to remove the regime in a more permanent fashion. So in Cuba, yes. Similarly, in terms of the EU trade deal that Nico was discussing, we also think post midterms, the president is going to go look back at all the trade deals he negotiated, and he's going to see if whether or not the blocs like the EU or the countries like Indonesia or whoever else have lived up to their obligations. And if he feels they haven't, and again, the issue is it's not really possible for these countries to have lived up to their obligations, he's going to reassert himself and say, you have not done X, Y, and Z. If you do not do this within 30 days, I am going to escalate and apply more tariffs or use further authorities to cause chaos within your own respective country or bloc. For us, even though we all understand on this call that tariffs are not helpful to the economy, the president fundamentally believes that tariffs are key, one, to reshoring production, and two, generating revenue for the American people and for the federal government. And for him, these trade deals and them being carried out are a critical part of his legacy. So that as well. Thirdly, we do expect him to once again refocus on Greenland. And while no, that does not mean we expect there to be the boots on the ground moment, we do expect the pressure to escalate again post midterms and for there to need to be a deal. And that will have to be a deal that includes Denmark, EU, perhaps NATO, and the US that will have to become some sort of agreement between the two that it satiates the president's demands. And as Nico was laying out, this will be more complicated as Europe is going into 2027 election cycle. But we do expect the president's aspirations for Greenland to continue to strengthen. And while they've been distracted by the current skirmish in Iran, post midterms the focus will go there. In terms of China, I think we're still in this place of a status quo where the president very much does not want to rock the economy. And I think he is still sensitive to that. And also, I think this speaks more to his psychology. He is more willing to work with leaders like Xi than he is like leaders like Mark Carney in Canada. And there has still been, while he has appointed hawks on China, his approach has largely been oriented towards deal making. And it seems like it's going to be that way for the time being. In terms of Israel, I think that's a fascinating question. It's something that's important to ask, especially today. If you look at it, there's a pre-Trump Republican Party and a post-Trump Republican Party. The pre-Trump Republican Party, many of whom are still in the Senate in particular, are very much pro-Israel. But the new generation of Republican voters, largely embodied by the likes of Vice President J.D. Vance, do not particularly care about Israel, or if anything, are antagonistic towards Israel and want a reassessment of the U.S.-Israel relationship. Now, I don't think that's going to come post midterms from the president himself. I think while I have never thought that the president is particularly committed to Israel like other past presidents were, it is more of a transactional relationship. He is not yet in a place to completely dissuade himself from supporting Israel. However, I do think Vice President J.D. Vance, those who work under him, and those who are his followers are likely to shape a Republican Party that is more antagonistic towards Israel, that does not view the U.S.-Israel relationship as critical to the future of the country, and views other regional allies, perhaps Saudi Arabia, perhaps the UAE, perhaps Qatar, perhaps Turkey, as more beneficial relationships than Israel itself. I think we are entering a new age where since 2015, Bibi Netanyahu has poisoned the Democratic Party against Israel. We are now entering an age where the likes of J.D. Vance and others will will reshape the Republican Party's approach to Israel and basically leave Israel within the next 5 to 10 years without many allies in this country. But it's not going to be a that's not going to be a post midterm thing just yet. In terms of the midterms themselves, our base case as of today, as I said before, was that Democrats are going to keep the Democrats will take the House, so the lower chamber of Congress, while Republicans are likely to just keep the Senate. In the Senate, currently put the odds of Republicans holding it at 60%. So there is a very strong chance Democrats take it. And I would say if we had had this conversation in November, I would have said more like 80-20. It speaks to the degradation of the electoral environment in the United States and the strength of candidates Democrats have recruited. In terms of races, I would recommend you follow. There's a couple. As you're following news from the United States, I would look at states including Alaska, which I know is quite distant, but Alaska is a race where Democrat Mary Peltola is running, and I believe she's going to beat her Republican. That would get Democrats to 48 seats. Additionally, Democrats are going to win in North Carolina, so they will take that Senate seat. Okay, let me pause this midterm. So I apologize. It's a question I want to answer more about policy related things, about Kevin Warsh's approach will become another tool for the United States to project its influence abroad. That Kevin Warsh is basically another tool for the U.S. to project influence through monetary policy. I think that is correct. I think if you want, we can even go back to the passage of the Genius Act last year. Genius Act was a legislation that set out the stablecoin framework that we have today and basically ensures that U.S. Treasury-backed stablecoins will guarantee it. As part of that bill, and one big reason that bill had significant bipartisan support was that it literally seeks to export our stablecoin regulations to countries that adopt U.S. Treasury-backed stablecoins. We are definitely using fiscal and monetary policy to expand our influence. The expectation is as stablecoins become more and more common and used of payments, and while countries, for example, like the UK are attempting to impose a cap of 20K, it will be unsustainable and it will be unsustainable and stable coins will become part and parcel of the US's power projection abroad and moreover help the US government with deficit financing. And we do and from my understanding, the Department of Treasury views any aggressive approach against U.S. stablecoins in a negative light, and the Treasury does not particularly care about the presence of U.S. stablecoins and their destabilizing effects on emerging markets, and they view that as a positive, as they feel that they would have more influence over the government. In terms of Warsh himself, you are correct that Warsh does intend to use as part and parcel of the administration's approach to using monetary policy to project power abroad, but I do think he is going to be kept more in check. It is not because of who he is as a person, but I think it is because of the way the institution is currently, the institution of the Fed as an institution is currently functioning. Last year, there was constant conversations about two governors retiring, Barr and Waller. If those two governors had retired at that juncture, the impression I received was that the new chair Warsh and Governor Bowman and those two new appointees who would come from the likes of Judy Shelton and David Malpass, who would be very much more pro the president. That juncture, we would have the president would have complete control of the Fed, and there would be considerable influence and changes in policies that would weaken the Fed's independence. The conversations we have today are quite clear that one, neither Barr nor Waller are planning on leaving anytime soon. They are continuing to stay. Secondly, is my understanding is former Chair Powell will continue to stay as a governor until he knows that the Fed is in a secure place. And that means likely either Democrats taking the Senate or them not being or Trump not being able to appoint a more radical policymaker to the board. But yes, overall, and I guess this is where we can discuss about the Mar-a-Lago Accords or the Mar-a-Lago Doctrine, which was actually written by Stephen Myron before the election. That is former Governor Stephen Myron. That idea is basically that post midterms, we force those countries to own our debt to basically redo it on the interest rate, lower the interest rates on the debt, and threaten our security funding. While we've not yet heard that much discussed, that has been an idea that was previously discussed before the president took office, and there are advocates in and around the White House and the Treasury Department. So For this presidency, for this administration, they view their monetary policy as part and parcel of their foreign policy power projection. Going back to the midterms, the states you should follow are Alaska, Maine, Iowa, Texas, North Carolina, Georgia, and Michigan in the Senate. Those states will basically decide the Senate. Right now, Democrats would need to win 4 seats. My expectation is we're going to get a split Senate, which means there'll be 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats. Due to our system of governance, that would mean that the Senate would remain in Republican hands, and the most powerful senator would be a woman named Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. Beyond that, we do expect the Democrats to take the House, and we are expecting around a 10 to 20 seat majority, and that's more just because every midterm cycle, the president's party gets punished. And even with the map changes in the map that have happened this past year, Democrats still have enough to win and win a relatively compelling majority. Now, in this scenario, where we have a Democratic House and a Republican Senate, the most significant impact will be seen in two specific policies. Firstly, as I was touching on earlier, I would expect further government shutdowns and more instability regarding government funding and use of money, and a president being more willing to abuse appropriations powers and try to fund things he prefers despite Congress not funding it. So we're going to see more of that, and that will create instability, uncertainty, and dysfunction within the US government. And secondly, and probably most importantly, and it's not being discussed enough, we will have to lift our debt ceiling. And the debt ceiling is basically the idea that we have a number that if we either a date or a number, this time it's a number that we basically can't go beyond and without our bonds basically collapsing. And right now, the expectation is we're going to hit our debt ceiling sometime in quarter one in Q1. My understanding is through something called extraordinary measures, we can probably get through summer. But by end of summer, early fall of 2027, we will need to raise our debt ceiling. And I do not expect Democrats to be willing to do that without getting something in return. So basically, they will be holding the debt ceiling hostage. And this is not trying to be partisan view. They will be attempting to negotiate the debt ceiling for something in return, which will leave the market shaken and uncertain. And while the markets may be tranquil and say this always happens because it does happen relatively often, I think the markets are underpricing the risk that we're going to have where Democrats and a more progressive Democratic base and those Democrats who want to run for president in 2028 saying, we will not allow this to happen, especially as you fund, wars in Iran, incursions in Greenland, things in Cuba, go against our democratic institutions without some kind of guarantees in return. And that is a concern that I've had now for about 6 months, and it's only intensified. Going beyond the midterms, I think the next big thing to be on the watch for, and this is covering both my time covering US and Canada, is the future of the USMCA. We have been fortunate where Signum has hosted events in Ottawa, where we were fortunate enough to speak with key policymakers, and have had conversations. And while I understand the Canadian approach to trade and very much understand that they're uncomfortable with the US's approach to Canada, and it is unacceptable considering our long history of a stable and friendly relationship, they seem to be under the impression that this status quo, where we continue to have some tariffs on Canada, but goods imported under the USMCA agreement are not subject to tariffs, is sustainable. And from my conversations with folks in the US, with policymakers and staffers, that is just not true. The US has escalation dominance in this field, and the Canadian approach is doing nothing but alienating and angering the administration. And I think while the Canadians seem to believe that this status quo is sustainable and that even if the USMCA is not renewed, they will not suffer consequences because they said, and this is what we heard from policymakers, that at that juncture we would just be granted most favored nation status. That is not how the US views Canada. The US widely expects Canada to be subservient to its interests and to be basically the little brother of this partnership. And I think Mark Carney and others in the government, while understandably so for the reasons of domestic policy, are underappreciating the risk they're incurring. Similarly, from our analyst who covers Latin America, the Mexican approach, while divergent, because Trump and President of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, have a productive relationship, Mexico seems to be treating this as a basically a technocratic negotiation that, okay, the US makes XYZ demand, so that means if we meet them halfway, they will be happy. The concern there is US Trade Representative Jameson Greer is very much saying, no, we want everything we're demanding. And while Trump and Sheinbaum have a productive relationship, there are still quite stringent demands that is either not able to meet or is unwilling to meet. And I think this all leads to a place where yes, we're going to blow by July 1, the deadline to state the intentions, but also that we're going to enter a more uncertain phase. And particularly, even though I know there are legal theorists who claim Congress would play a role, the escalation clause, the escape clause within the USMCA allows the president to react unilaterally and trigger a termination within 6 months, which means basically as Canada and Mexico continue to play chicken or continue to not satisfy the US's demands, the president can say, okay, then in 6 months this deal is dead. And the reality is, as much as the US benefits from USMCA, the administration, and honestly, even the Canadians' perspective is Canada and Mexico need USMCA more than US. So I think that has us in a very uncertain place with trade. And I would expect more headlines and more escalatory dominance from the administration. Beyond that, I guess I apologize, not don't want to take too much more of your time. I'll touch on the AI approach because that's been covered a lot. In my conversations, I think the best way to break this down is into three different pathways. The first pathway is for the first year and a half of the Trump administration. Basically, the tech optimists, the pro AI development folks, were in charge of making policy. That was like David Sachs and his man named Krishnan, who were basically running policy. And they largely drafted the White House's national policy framework for AI, which encouraged this light touch approach. David Sachs left the White House in March, and Krishnan is leaving the office at the end of this month. And with their departures, basically the hawks, and that includes our National Cyber Director, Sean Cairncross, and our Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, have reasserted themselves and basically said, both out of concerns for national security, but also for concerns for the future of the financial markets, that we need to be more aggressive. So they've been able to exert more influence than they have previously. Secondly, and this speaks to a wider issue with this administration, they keep on pushing Congress to do AI regulation, to issue AI legislation, to give them a framework with which the White House can act. The issue is the administration and the president in particular does not want to give up any power. He is not willing to negotiate with Congress. And in fact, he wants to ensure that no state can regulate AI other than the federal government. And with Democrats likely to take control of the House only a couple months, there is not much incentive for Democrats to work with the president to really facilitate a quote unquote AI regulatory framework that would give both the US and our international allies like the EU more regulatory stability. And I don't think we're going to get a resolution by November. And as we get closer to the midterms, there's going to be much less interest from Democrats in working on such policy. And finally, and I think this is the most absurd part of the story, Anthropic has not done a good job of building out this relationship with the White House. Yes, this could be considered for some relatively partisan or unacceptable reasons, but the administration does not like Anthropic, and it wants to see Anthropic bend the knee to the president. And until they're willing to do that and meet the president in a way that's positive for the president, I think we're going to continue to see the instability. Moreover, and my understanding is the White House was surprised by other AI companies' response to the Anthropic policy. Because for them, the White House, they still very much advocate a light touch approach and very much want to be hands off to an extent. But they do not understand how that policy change so shook the AI industry. And it speaks to kind of the naivete of the administration and their inability to really reconcile their light touch demands with expectation of loyalty from Frontier Labs. And I think we're entering a phase where between the Hawks winning out, control of Congress flipping at least one chamber, and the administration not being able to reconcile its differences into much more an unstable and uncertain regulatory future for AI. And this says nothing about the changing politics of AI, where Yes, partly due to the president's embrace of the technology, but also in response to the AI leaders, so Sam Altman, Dario Amodei, and others failing to make a case for the positive use of AI. American voters of all political persuasions are now very much anti-AI and they're anti-data centers. So much like this current stage we're in is the high point for the US-EU relationship in terms of future Republican administrations, I also believe this point of where we are today is going to be the high point for AI development in the US, and we are going to enter post midterms a much more unfriendly environment for AI. And I expect in 2028, candidates of both parties for the presidency will be explicitly anti-AI. So I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone that has a last question for our speaker? I'll let you a couple of seconds. We had a lot of great questions. Thank you very much, George. Thank you, Nico, who left already for another meeting.
Thank you for this opportunity. And as always, if anyone wants to reach out to us for questions, I think, Sonia, you have our emails. Please
Yeah.
feel free to share them. We are available 24/7 and always happy to help. And again, hopefully we get to do this again in the future.
Yes. Thank you very much, George. Everyone, have a great day. See you soon.
See you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.